By April, Catherine's understanding of Sweetwater had evolved into something more dangerous, the realization that subtle, ethically guided interventions were possible without exposing herself. She began experimenting quietly, adjusting the way she recorded traits in the ledger, emphasizing certain details to shift Nathaniel's selections, and guiding Harrove's attention away from the more vulnerable children. Each subtle act was a calculated test. Could she protect the enslaved while remaining invisible to the men who believed themselves all-seeing? Her observations of the women deepened. Ruth, Grace, and others offered glimpses of human resilience, even under crushing oppression. Catherine catalogued every gesture, every look, every silent warning. These signals became tools for predicting behavior and guiding small interventions. A glance exchanged, a hesitant step, or a subtle change in tone all contained vital information. Catherine learned to read these cues with precision, translating them into strategies that could mitigate harm without disrupting the system's appearance of total control. Psychologically, the tension was immense. Horror and moral outrage pressed against her constantly, but she had learned to channel these forces into analytical clarity. Dissociation allowed her to witness atrocities without being paralyzed, transforming fear and disgust into a map of the network's vulnerabilities. Observation had become strategy. Trauma had become insight. She understood that even in a system designed for absolute domination, the mind capable of seeing patterns could carve out spaces of subtle power. Catherine began implementing small protective measures. She shifted focus in ledger entries to downplay certain traits, diverted attention from particularly vulnerable children, and used her notes to suggest minor errors that would buy Ruth and Grace small reprieve. Each act was invisible, reversible, and calculated. The men continued to believe they controlled every outcome, while Catherine quietly shaped outcomes to preserve life where she could. By the end of April, Catherine had achieved a new level of mastery. She was no longer merely observing the machinery of Sweetwater. She was quietly manipulating it. Knowledge, patience, and moral clarity allowed her to navigate a system built on fear and secrecy, creating pockets of subtle protection without detection. She had become both strategist and guardian, operating invisibly within the network while maintaining her cover. In the shadow of cruelty, Catherine had discovered a dangerous truth. The mind that sees clearly can bend even the most. By May, Catherine's perspective expanded beyond the confines of Sweetwater. Harrove's correspondence and Nathaniel's remarks revealed that the network of plantations participating in selective breeding was far broader than she had imagined. Sweetwater was a single node in an intricate lattice of exploitation stretching across Georgia and into South Carolina, a system built on secrecy, meticulous documentation, and the illusion of scientific legitimacy. The network was a machine designed to manipulate life itself, and Catherine now understood its predictable logic. She began tracing the connections mentally, noting which plantations received children, which planters corresponded with Harrove, and how certain traits were prioritized and exchanged. Each ledger entry at Sweetwater was a clue, a microcosm of a much larger system. The removal of children was no longer an isolated horror. It was a methodical redistribution of human life according to perceived value. Catherine's mind mapped the flow of people, information, and power, revealing weaknesses hidden beneath the network's surface. Patterns emerged: timing of removals, selection criteria, transport routes, and predictable reactions from both men and enslaved populations. Knowledge, she realized, was the key to influence. Her role as an observer-strategist deepened. She could anticipate Nathaniel and Harrove's next moves, subtly guiding attention in ways that preserved her invisibility while protecting the most vulnerable. The enslaved women remained central to her calculations. Their silent cues, glances, shifts in posture, murmured warnings, became signals of potential leverage. Catherine began documenting these alongside ledger details, creating a layered understanding of both human behavior and systemic operation. Even in a network designed to erase agency, patterns could be anticipated and exploited. Psychologies. Callie, Catherine's evolution continued. Dissociation remained vital, allowing her to witness atrocities without succumbing to despair. Observation, however, had transformed into deliberate strategy. Each ledger entry, each conversation, each subtle manipulation was part of a larger plan to understand, anticipate, and influence without detection. Fear, horror, and moral outrage were transformed into clarity, precision, and patience. In the machinery of cruelty, Catherine had found her mind to be both shield and scalpel. By the end of May, Catherine realized a profound truth. The network's reliance on secrecy, predictable behavior, and rigid adherence to procedure was its weakness. Sweetwater was not invulnerable. Knowledge, patience, and subtle intervention could ripple outward, influencing outcomes beyond her immediate environment. She was no longer merely surviving, she was navigating and subtly shaping a system that others believed absolute. The machinery of control could be bent, and in bending it, Catherine discovered her first taste of invisible power. By June, Catherine's confidence in her subtle influence had grown. Observation had transformed into strategic action, and the ledger, once a tool of Nathaniel's domination, had become her instrument. She began guiding decisions with deliberate phrasing, emphasizing certain traits in children to redirect attention, and highlighting minor inconsistencies in Harrove's measurements. Each intervention was small, imperceptible, yet precise, testing the limits of the system without revealing her awareness. She had become a strategist, moving invisibly within a network that believed itself absolute. The enslaved women remained central to her calculations. Catherine observed every glance, hesitation, and whispered warning, noting patterns of resilience and resistance. These subtle cues became tools for prediction, allowing her to anticipate behavior and outcomes. Ruth, Grace, and others, though trapped and terrified, exhibited moments of agency that Catherine catalogued meticulously. She realized that the network relied not only on fear and secrecy, but on the assumption of passive compliance. Where compliance faltered, there existed leverage. Psychologically, Catherine walked a razor's edge. Dissociation allowed her to witness horrors without being paralyzed, while careful analysis transformed trauma into insight. Each act of subtle intervention demanded precision and patience. One misstep could expose her, endanger the women, or unravel her fragile control. And yet, the risk was necessary. Knowledge, she understood, was not passive. It was a weapon. Observation without action achieved little. The system could only be influenced by those who understood both its mechanics and its human elements. Harrove's network, while vast and methodical, contained predictable patterns that Catherine could exploit. Timing of removals, ledger documentation, and the men's reliance on secrecy created openings. Small interventions, adjusting emphasis, phrasing observations, or subtly guiding attention allowed Catherine to shape outcomes without detection. Each experiment, no matter how minor, provided insight into the system's vulnerabilities and the limits of control. By the end of June, Catherine had achieved a delicate balance. She remained an invisible participant in Sweetwater's machinery while quietly manipulating outcomes to preserve life and mitigate suffering. Knowledge, patience, and subtle action had transformed her from passive witness to strategist, and the ledger, once a symbol of terror, was now a map of influence. In the shadow of cruelty, Catherine had discovered a dangerous truth. Absolute power is never invulnerable, and the mind that sees clearly can bend even the most rigid system. By July, Catherine's quiet mastery over Sweetwater's network reached a new stage. She began coordinating small, deliberate protective strategies for the enslaved children, manipulating ledger entries and subtly guiding Nathaniel's attention away from those most vulnerable. Every adjustment was calculated, never enough to expose her awareness, yet sufficient to create tiny pockets of safety. Observation had evolved into intervention, strategy into covert action. She was no longer just surviving the system, she was quietly reshaping it. The enslaved women became co-conspirators in subtle ways, though neither Nathaniel nor Harrove realized it. Catherine noted Ruth's evasive glances, Grace's careful movements, and the unspoken codes among the mothers. These signals, previously just data, now became instruments of protection. By understanding their rhythms and cues, Catherine could anticipate moments of danger and adjust outcomes discreetly. Even within an environment designed for total control, human agency found its cracks, and she learned to exploit them with precision. Psychologically, Catherine's mind had transformed into a weapon as sharp as any physical tool. Horror and moral anguish remained constants, pressing relentlessly, but she had learned to convert them into analytical clarity. Dissociation allowed her to witness atrocities without breaking, turning fear into focus and trauma into actionable insight. Each ledger entry, each observation, became part of a strategy aimed at quietly mitigating suffering without detection. Patience, precision, and discretion were her greatest allies. Harrove's network, far-reaching and seemingly omnipotent, contained predictable vulnerabilities. Timing of child removals, ledger inconsistencies, and the men's reliance on secrecy all created opportunities. Catherine began exploiting these openings, testing reactions, and refining her approach. Small interventions produced subtle shifts, guiding Nathaniel's decisions while keeping her influence invisible. She had learned that in a system built on fear, secrecy, and assumed compliance, subtlety could achieve what force could not. By the end of July, Catherine had fully embraced her role as an invisible strategist. She could anticipate movements, subtly influence outcomes, and protect lives without revealing her awareness. Sweetwater's machinery of cruelty, vast and meticulously constructed, was not infallible. Knowledge, patience, and strategic subtlety had transformed Catherine from passive witness to a covert architect of influence. In the shadows of domination, she discovered a profound truth. Mastery over a system built on fear does not require confrontation. By August, Catherine's quiet interventions had grown bolder, though still imperceptible to Nathaniel and Harrove. She began anticipating their decisions with increasing precision, predicting which children would be targeted next, and subtly adjusting her ledger entries to protect the most vulnerable. Every detail mattered: the phrasing of her observations, the emphasis on minor traits, and the timing of her notations. Sweetwater's system, once absolute in her eyes, now revealed itself as manipulable by a mind patient and observant enough to perceive its patterns. The enslaved women remained her silent collaborators. Catherine catalogued every gesture, every subtle warning, and every moment of quiet resistance. These signals became instruments of protection. A glance that indicated a child's vulnerability, a hesitation in compliance that could be leveraged to delay or misdirect attention, or a coded word that allowed Catherine to act preemptively. By interpreting these cues alongside ledger data, she created a layered map of both human behavior and systemic operation, learning how to bend the machinery of cruelty without exposure. Psychologically, Catherine's transformation was profound. Horror and moral anguish remained constant, yet dissociation had sharpened into a tool of strategic clarity. She could observe atrocities without being paralyzed, turning fear into actionable insight and trauma into calculation. The ledger, once a symbol of oppression, was now a blueprint for subtle intervention. Patience, precision, and discretion were her weapons. Knowledge had become mastery, and observation had evolved into a disciplined form of control. Harrove's broader network, stretching across plantations, remained predictable in its methods. Patterns in timing, selection criteria, and the men's reliance on secrecy allowed Catherine to anticipate outcomes beyond Sweetwater. Small manipulations, shifting focus in her records, emphasizing particular traits, or noting minor inconsistencies, enabled her to influence decisions invisibly. Each intervention tested the system, refining her understanding of its vulnerabilities and extending her reach. By the end of August, Catherine had become something more than a witness, a strategist operating within the machinery of oppression. She could influence outcomes, anticipate decisions, and create pockets of protection without detection. Sweetwater's system, vast and meticulously constructed, was not absolute. Knowledge, patience, and subtle manipulation had transformed Catherine into an invisible agent of justice, operating in the shadows where fear and secrecy reigned. She had discovered a dangerous truth. In a world built on domination, mastery lies not in confrontation. By September, Catherine's understanding had expanded beyond Sweetwater and even beyond Nathaniel's immediate control. Harrove's network stretched across multiple plantations, a hidden lattice of influence, selective breeding, and human manipulation. Children were being catalogued, removed, and distributed with meticulous attention to traits deemed valuable: skin tone, intelligence, temperament, each decision cloaked in the veneer of scientific legitimacy. Catherine realized that the atrocities she witnessed were a single node in a much larger system, one designed to perpetuate itself for generations. She began mentally mapping this network. Every ledger entry, every letter, every whispered detail provided insight into the broader mechanics. Which plantations received children? Which planters corresponded with Harrove? How did timing and selection operate across distances? Catherine's diary, hidden beneath the floorboards, had transformed into a blueprint of human exploitation, revealing patterns that were predictable and therefore manipulable. The system's reach was vast, but its predictability was a vulnerability she could exploit. Catherine also deepened her understanding of human behavior within the network. Ruth, Grace, and the other women conveyed subtle signals, gestures, expressions, and coded speech that revealed compliance, fear, and resistance. Catherine catalogued these alongside ledger data, creating a layered map of both systemic operation and human agency. Even in a system designed to erase individuality, the human element introduced unpredictability. By interpreting these signals, she could anticipate reactions, influence outcomes, and protect those she could, without ever revealing her awareness. Psychologically, Catherine had become a master of observation and dissociation. Horror no longer paralyzed her. Fear became data, and trauma became strategy. The ledger, once a symbol of oppression, was now a tool of influence. Each subtle intervention, each adjustment to phrasing or emphasis, allowed her to bend the system invisibly. She had learned that the machinery of cruelty relied on secrecy, routine, and compliance, and that these dependencies were exploitable if one observed with patience and precision. By the end of September, Catherine had achieved a dangerous equilibrium. She was an invisible agent within a vast network of power, able to anticipate movements, manipulate outcomes, and protect lives subtly. Sweetwater, Harrove's network, and Nathaniel's ambitions were not infallible. Knowledge, patience, and subtle intervention could bend even the most absolute system. Catherine had become a strategist, operating in the shadows, where fear reigned and domination seemed absolute. And in that darkness, by October, Catherine had moved from isolated interventions to small, systemic disruptions. She began orchestrating subtle shifts that rippled through Sweetwater's operations and, potentially, through Harrove's broader network. A child's measurement emphasized differently in the ledger, a trait noted in a certain way, or a slight delay in Nathaniel's scheduling, all seemingly minor, could cascade, creating small but meaningful changes in the system. Each action was invisible, deliberate, and precise. The enslaved women remained central to this strategy. Ruth, Grace, and others continued to provide critical signals through gestures, glances, and hushed words. Catherine used these cues to anticipate movements, delay harmful outcomes, and create opportunities for protection. Their resilience, though constrained, became part of a layered network of influence. She had learned to read the subtle language of human agency within a system designed to erase it. turning survival into strategy. Psychologically, Catherine's mind had become a scalpel. Dissociation allowed her to witness horrors without being consumed, while strategic analysis converted trauma into actionable insight. Each ledger entry was no longer a passive record. It was a tool for influence. Patience, observation, and subtlety were her allies. She understood that the system's reliance on secrecy, routine, and compliance was a weakness she could exploit to protect lives without detection. Knowledge had become mastery, and mastery, in turn, became action. Harrove's network, though vast and meticulously maintained, was predictable. Patterns in child removal, trait selection, and transport schedules could be anticipated. By nudging these patterns ever so slightly, Catherine began testing the extent of her influence. Small delays in selections, subtle emphasis on less desirable traits, and minor discrepancies in records allowed her to shape outcomes invisibly. Each adjustment, though seemingly inconsequential, subtly challenged the network's rigidity. By the end of October, Catherine had evolved into an unseen architect within Sweetwater and the surrounding network. Her interventions were invisible but effective, her strategies precise, and her understanding of systemic operations profound. The machinery of cruelty, vast and carefully constructed, was not absolute. Knowledge, patience, and subtle action allowed her to bend the system without detection, creating pockets of protection and influence where none should have existed. In the shadows of domination, by November, Catherine's influence had begun to stretch beyond Sweetwater's immediate confines. She realized that Harrove's network, though sprawling and secretive, relied heavily on rigid routines, predictable behavior, and unquestioned authority. These dependencies were vulnerabilities, and Catherine began experimenting with indirect interventions that could ripple across Plantations without ever alerting Nathaniel or Harrove. A subtle shift in a ledger entry here, a carefully worded observation there, could influence decisions miles away, shaping the fate of children and women she would never see. The enslaved women remained her vital guides. Ruth, Grace, and others, through glances, gestures, and coded words, continued to provide critical information about behavior, timing, and vulnerabilities. Catherine catalogued every signal, translating human resilience into strategic insight. The network, built to crush agency, now revealed cracks she could exploit. Each action she took, though invisible, was informed by an intimate understanding of the human element, amplifying the reach and effectiveness of her subtle manipulations. Psychologically, Catherine had achieved a dangerous equilibrium. Horror and moral outrage pressed constantly against her consciousness, yet dissociation allowed her to observe with clarity. Fear became data, trauma became strategy, and the ledger became a tool of influence rather than oppression. Each entry, each note, and each small intervention was part of a larger pattern she could anticipate and guide. Knowledge had become power, and subtlety had become her weapon of choice. Harrove's network, while seemingly omnipotent, depended on secrecy and unbroken routines. Catherine identified opportunities to exploit these weaknesses. Slight delays in the documentation process, emphasis on less desirable traits, and minor alterations in phrasing allowed her to nudge outcomes without raising suspicion. By observing the patterns of correspondence and movement, she began to influence decisions beyond Sweetwater, creating a web of subtle impact that extended through the system like a silent current. By the end of November, Catherine had become a strategist operating invisibly across a sprawling network of control. She could predict behavior, manipulate outcomes, and create protective ripples without detection. Sweetwater's machinery of cruelty, vast and meticulously constructed, was no longer untouchable. Knowledge, patience, and precise, invisible intervention had transformed her from witness to unseen architect, bending a system designed for domination and oppression. In the shadows, she had discovered a profound truth. Mastery does not always require confrontation. Sometimes By December, Catherine's vision had expanded to long-term strategy. Sweetwater was no longer the sole focus. She began mapping patterns across multiple plantations, tracing Harrove's network and identifying predictable routines in child selection, removals, and record-keeping. Each ledger entry, each subtle observation, was now part of a comprehensive understanding of a system that stretched across counties. Catherine realized that with patience and precision, she could extend her protective influence far beyond the walls of her home. The enslaved women remained central to this strategy. Ruth, Grace, and others continued to provide signals of human resilience, subtle gestures, hushed words, and evasive movements. Catherine catalogued these alongside ledger details, creating an integrated map of systemic operation and human behavior. She could anticipate actions, guide outcomes, and protect those most vulnerable, all while remaining invisible to Nathaniel and Harrove. Human agency, she discovered, was the ultimate leverage in a system designed to crush it. Psychologically, Catherine had mastered the delicate balance between dissociation and engagement. Horror and moral outrage were constants, yet they were harnessed as tools of clarity. Observation had become strategy, trauma had become insight, and knowledge had become power. Each subtle ledger adjustment, each careful phrasing, was part of a broader plan to mitigate harm and bend the system without detection. Patience, precision, and discretion were her allies. Harrove's network, meticulously constructed yet predictable, revealed vulnerabilities across distance. Timing of removals, correspondence routines, and reliance on secrecy created openings. Catherine began testing small interventions with ripple effects, minor delays, carefully emphasized traits, and subtle discrepancies in records. These actions created invisible pressure, shaping outcomes far beyond Sweetwater while leaving Nathaniel and Harrove unaware. Each intervention extended her influence, turning knowledge into strategic leverage. By the end of December, Catherine had evolved into a covert architect of influence across a sprawling, cruel network. Sweetwater's machinery of domination, though vast, was manipulable through observation, subtle intervention, and strategic understanding of human behavior. She had become invisible yet powerful, bending systems of oppression without confrontation. Knowledge, patience, and calculated subtlety were her weapons. In the shadows of cruelty, Catherine had discovered the ultimate truth. Mastery does not require force. It requires perception, strategy, and the courage to. By January, Catherine's interventions began forming a network of influence that extended far beyond Sweetwater. Every ledger entry, every subtle nudge, and every whispered cue from the enslaved women was now part of a larger system she was manipulating with invisible precision. She began to link patterns across plantations, child removals, trait selection, transport routines, using these insights to protect those most vulnerable and subtly guide outcomes without alerting Nathaniel or Harrove. The enslaved women continued to be her silent allies. Ruth, Grace, and the others communicated in subtle, coded ways, glances, pauses, shifts in posture that revealed both fear and opportunity. Catherine catalogued each signal meticulously, combining human observation with systemic patterns. Where the network assumed compliance, she discovered leverage. She could anticipate actions and exploit the men's reliance on secrecy and routine, creating protective ripples that extended across miles, invisible yet consequential. Psychologically, Catherine had become a master of both observation and calculated dissociation. Horror, moral outrage, and fear were constant companions, yet she transformed them into analytic clarity. Trauma became insight, observation became strategy, and subtle action became influence. Each ledger entry, each carefully worded note, was a tool to bend the system invisibly, safeguarding lives and testing the boundaries of control. Patience and precision were her most dangerous allies. Harrove's network, while far-reaching and meticulously maintained, contained predictable vulnerabilities. Patterns in correspondence, timing, and documentation created openings for subtle manipulation. Catherine experimented with minor discrepancies, phrasing variations, and carefully timed adjustments that nudged outcomes in protective directions. Even the smallest ripple could influence decisions across plantations, and each successful intervention reinforced her understanding of systemic dynamics. By the end of January, Catherine had become an invisible architect shaping the system itself. She could anticipate behavior, manipulate outcomes, and extend protection across a vast network without ever being discovered. Sweetwater's machinery of cruelty, though enormous, was not absolute. Knowledge, patience, and subtlety had transformed her from passive witness into strategist, manipulator, and protector. In the shadows of domination, Catherine understood a dangerous truth. Mastery is not measured by force, but by understanding, perception, and the courage to act. By February, Catherine's interventions reached their most audacious stage. She began influencing Harrove's decisions indirectly, shaping his focus and subtly altering the outcomes of his observations. Ledger entries were no longer just records. They were instruments of control, guiding the pseudo-scientific assessments that Nathaniel and Harrove relied upon. Each carefully worded note redirected attention, emphasized or minimized traits, and created protective outcomes without ever exposing her awareness. The enslaved women remained vital collaborators in this invisible strategy. Through glances, gestures, and subtle signals, they communicated vulnerability, resistance, and opportunity. Catherine's careful cataloging of these cues allowed her to anticipate Harrove's movements and influence his decisions at a distance. Even within a network that appeared absolute, human behavior was the hidden lever. By interpreting these signals alongside ledger patterns, she could bend the machinery of oppression quietly and precisely. Psychologically, Catherine had transformed completely. Dissociation allowed her to witness ongoing atrocities without breaking, while analytical clarity converted fear and horror into strategy. Trauma became insight, observation became power, and subtle action became leverage. Each ledger adjustment, each carefully timed intervention, was now part of a broader plan to influence outcomes across multiple plantations, all while remaining invisible to Nathaniel and Harrove. Knowledge had become mastery, and mastery had become influence. Harrove's network, despite its reach and meticulous documentation, was predictable. Timing, selection routines, and reliance on secrecy created opportunities. Catherine exploited these vulnerabilities with increasing sophistication, nudging attention, introducing minor discrepancies, and reshaping priorities. Her subtle manipulations rippled outward, protecting children and women without detection. She had learned that in a system built on fear, secrecy, and assumed control, invisible influence was more powerful than confrontation. By the end of February, Catherine had become an invisible force operating within an entire network of cruelty. She could predict behavior, manipulate outcomes, and protect lives across miles, all while maintaining the facade of compliance. Sweetwater, Nathaniel, and Harrove's network, vast and seemingly omnipotent, were not invulnerable. Knowledge, patience, and subtle intervention had transformed Catherine from witness into strategist, protector, and architect. In the shadows, she had discovered the ultimate truth. Mastery requires perception. The first thing you must understand is that some secrets were never meant to surface. Some truths are buried so deeply in the earth of human history that if they are unearthed, they leave a stain on your mind that never fades. Imagine, if you can, a house in the humid heart of Georgia in 1760, its walls made not of wood and plaster alone, but of unspoken rules, cruelty, and silent complicity. The wealthy planter, Nathaniel, had a sterile wife. Her womb, the instrument of life, had failed, and yet his obsession with legacy and control would not be denied. What happened next is not a story for the faint of heart. Nathaniel, methodical and cold, decided that if nature would not provide him heirs, he would engineer them, not through invention, not through diplomacy, but through the bodies of enslaved women under his ownership. And worse, he demanded that his wife, Catherine, witness every detail, every act, as though she were a student in the most horrifying classroom imaginable. She was ordered to document what he called the improvement of our people, an experiment in human breeding that transformed women into property, children into commodities, and morality into something malleable. Catherine's diary, written in the trembling script of a woman forced into complicity, reveals her first impressions. The silence of Ruth, the first woman selected as Nathaniel claimed her body for his designs. The way her husband's calm, almost reverent demeanor made horror feel like ritual, the precise measurements and observations catalogued as if she were noting the growth of wheat or the yield of livestock. Every detail mattered. Height, strength, temperament, skin tone, eye color, they were all recorded. Every child born became a data point in Nathaniel's ledger, a step toward some imagined perfection. But consider the psychological weight. Catherine was compelled to watch, to recce, awed to detach herself from what her eyes and heart could not ignore. She was forced into a form of dissociation that most people only glimpse in extreme trauma. And yet through this ordeal, the mind learns to survive, to observe without being consumed. Her role was both instrument and witness, powerless to stop the horror, yet essential to its perpetuation. And this is only the beginning. There are layers beneath layers here, networks of complicity, a science twisted into pseudo-legitimacy, men corresponding with each other under the guise of progress while orchestrating atrocities. What you are about to hear will challenge what you think you know about human nature, morality, and the hidden structures of power. Keep your mind open. Nathaniel's vision was methodical. It was not born of rage nor mere greed. It was a precise clinical obsession with control, over bodies, over life, over legacy itself. He had read, corresponded, and studied ideas of selective breeding circulating quietly among the men who believed themselves enlightened. To them, humans were no different than horses or cattle. Every child could be optimized, every woman could be assessed for traits that would enhance the plantation's future, and Nathaniel intended to apply these theories personally, experimentally, ruthlessly. Catherine watched, sitting in the corner of a cold, sparsely furnished room, pen and paper trembling in her hands. The first woman, Ruth, was brought before her. Ruth's body, tall and strong from years of labor, was catalogued with obsessive precision. Catherine noted every curve, every subtle detail of health and vitality. She recorded demeanor, responsiveness, and, most painfully, her silence. Ruth did not cry out. Perhaps she had resigned herself to the inevitability of the plantation's laws, the unspoken hierarchy of power. Perhaps she had learned that resistance meant punishment far worse than this. Catherine later wrote, "God forgive me, I did as he commanded." Those words, so brief, betray the unspeakable moral dissonance she endured. Nathaniel's approach was cold and ritualistic. The women were not chosen at random. He had criteria, a vision of desirable traits, and he pursued it with the patience of a scientist. Catherine realized that this was more than exploitation. It was experimentation. She began to notice patterns. The traits Nathaniel sought, the way he recorded them meticulously, the attention to detail that seemed almost obsessive, were all part of a system he believed could manufacture perfection. Every pregnancy, every child was catalogued. Columns, headings, calculations, not names, not soul, but variables in a larger design. The atmosphere of Sweetwater shifted. Enslaved people moved through their work with hollow eyes, aware of the new horror imposed upon them. Men clutched their fists, women lowered their heads, understanding that compliance or silence was the only way to survive. And Catherine, trapped in the role of observer, began to dissociate from reality. She learned to focus on cracks in the plaster, the faint smell of burning lamp oil, the night insects. anything to separate her mind from the atrocity before her eyes. But even in dissociation, the knowledge sunk in. The plantation was a laboratory of human cruelty, and she was its scribe. By the time Nathaniel moved to the second woman, Catherine had begun to understand the scale of what he intended. This was not a single act of perverse control. This was a program, a system designed to reshape generations, to assert power not only over bodies, but over destiny itself. And somewhere in that realization, Catherine understood the first terrifying truth. Spring came to Baldwin County with a deceptive warmth, soft dogwood blossoms drifting like snow through the woods. But inside Sweetwater, the air was thick with a darker kind of life. Ruth, the first woman selected, became pregnant. Catherine confirmed it herself, a bitter twist of fate. Her own womb empty, yet she bore witness to the creation of life she could never claim. Nathaniel's satisfaction was almost palpable, measured in the careful notation he made in his ledger. Every column, every heading was a manifestation of control, physical characteristics, estimated intelligence, projected utility, temperament, breeding potential. The ledger transformed human beings into objects, and Catherine's hands trembled as she wrote, knowing that her observations made her complicit. Then came Grace, the second woman, barely 19, delicate in body, but not in her significance to Nathaniel's design. She was chosen with precision, studied for traits Nathaniel believed desirable, and soon the same cold ritual began. Catherine, seated as an unwilling witness, recorded every detail, noting not only the women's physicality, but their mannerisms, reactions, and even silence. Silence was the cruelest weapon. No outcry, no complaint, only compliance enforced by fear, power, and the ever-present threat of violence. Catherine's diary notes from this period are brief, almost clinical, as though brevity could protect her sanity, yet beneath the words, the horror pulses. And then there was Dinah, from the kitchen, whose body Nathaniel considered less remarkable, but no less subject to his obsessive control. The pattern became clear. Each woman, each pregnancy, was an experiment within a system designed to maximize the yield of human property. The children born were immediately measured, assessed, and catalogued. Some were taken away in the dead of night, disappearing into Harrove's net, work of planters who believed in the science of optimizing bloodlines. Others remained, their futures carefully considered as variables in Nathaniel's calculations. Catherine began to see the scope of this systematic cruelty, the depth of planning, the ideological framework that masked exploitation as progress. Psychologically, Catherine had to survive by fragmenting her mind. She noticed the smallest things, the crack in the plaster, the distant hum of cicadas, the smell of lamp oil, but her eyes were never free from the atrocities she documented. And through this, she began to understand something crucial. Power resides not only in the body that dominates, but in the mind that acquiesces. Nathaniel's experiment relied as much on her compliance as on Ruth's or Grace's bodies. Without her observations, without her ledger, the system could not function. By this point, the plantation had transformed. Sweetwater was no longer merely a place of labor. It had become a laboratory of obedience, surveillance, and meticulously structured horror. Every sound, every glance, every whispered word became a measure of control, and for Catherine, the realization came like ice in her veins. She could not escape, she could not intervene, and yet, in understanding the system, she could begin to manipulate it. It was in July that the experiment escalated. Dr. Cornelius Harrove arrived at Sweetwater, a portly man in his 50s with mutton-chop whiskers and hands that had likely never delivered pain or healed it. Yet he carried authority in the guise of science, representing the Medical Society of South Carolina, though Catherine would later learn his credentials were dubious at best. Harrove was fascinated by what Nathaniel had begun, the systematic observation, the cataloging, the breeding of enslaved women according to a twisted notion of desirable traits. He called it anthropological medicine, a cold, calculated euphemism that veiled the human cruelty beneath. From the moment he stepped inside the plantation, Catherine sensed the change. Harrove was not simply a visitor. He was an amplifier of Nathaniel's obsession. He measured skulls with brass calipers, weighed children, recorded hair texture, skin tone, eye color, and temperament with scientific precision. He asked questions under the pretense of interviews, questions designed to assess intelligence and character, reducing human lives to data points, and Catherine, ordered to assist him, recorded everything in meticulous detail. Every measurement, every observation became a testament to her forced complicity, her hands writing the language of oppression. Harrove's influence spread like a shadow over Sweetwater. He introduced Nathaniel to a network of planters who believed in optimizing human stock, sharing techniques, strategies, and observations. The children born under Nathaniel's program were no longer merely offspring. They were currency, experiments to be perfected, traded, and controlled. Catherine realized that what she had thought was horrific was only a fraction of a much larger, systemized cruelty. This was not isolated. It was part of a hidden infrastructure of power, hidden in plain sight beneath the veneer of Southern propriety. And Catherine began to see the moral rot embedded in the structure. Nathaniel's calm, measured demeanor, Harrove's scientific rationalizations, the silence of Ruth, Grace, and the other women, it all formed a machinery of domination. Every act, every observation was a mechanism for asserting absolute control. Catherine felt her own mind begin to fracture. To survive, she had to dissociate, focusing on small, trivial details. The crack in the plaster, the faint smell of herbs, the rhythm of a dripping tap, anything to separate herself from the horrors she catalogued. But there was a darker realization creeping into her consciousness. By observing, by recording, she was becoming part of the network. Her compliance enabled Nathaniel and Harrove. Her ledger, her diaries were instruments of their system. Yet within this horrifying awareness, a spark of resolve began to form. Catherine understood that knowledge is power, and if wielded carefully, even the compelled witness can become a force within the system. By the time the first child was born under this expanded program, Catherine knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was not just a bystander, she was a participant in a machine that treated life as property, innocence as data, and The first birth under Harrove's watch was a quiet catastrophe of morality. Grace delivered a boy, pale-skinned with eyes that would settle into a grey-green, a child Nathaniel deemed ideal for the ledger. Harrove measured, weighed, and recorded every feature with clinical detachment, while Catherine sat in the corner, pen poised, stomach twisting, heart breaking. Each notation in the ledger was a testament not to life, but to control. Every characteristic, skin, eyes, temperament, was catalogued, evaluated, and judged as if a soul could be measured like cotton yield or corn. That night, Catherine watched from an upstairs window as men came quietly, their wagon wheels creaking over the dirt path. They took the child, wrapped and silent, disappearing into the night. Ruth, the mother, did not cry. Her silence was resignation, the quiet horror of knowing that her child would vanish into a system she could neither resist nor influence. Catherine felt something break inside her. The ledger was more than a record. It was a mechanism for erasing life, for turning humans into property, for codifying cruelty. By the time Dinah, from the kitchen, went into labor, Catherine had begun her own secret ledger. Nathaniel's official records documented births, traits, and values, but Catherine's diary went deeper. She noted names, dates, disappearances, and patterns no one else dared to see. She began to understand the network Harrove described, the network of planters sharing children with desirable traits, optimizing bloodlines as if they were cattle. The system was meticulous, hidden in plain sight, justified under the veneer of science, law, and propriety. And Catherine, despite the terror, began to see its weak points, the cracks in its facade. Her psychological survival depended on dissociation. She learned to focus on irrelevancies, the crack in the plaster, the faint scent of fox, glove in the garden, the rhythm of night insects, anything to prevent her mind from collapsing under the weight of what she observed. But she also began to study the plants in her garden with intent, noticing those with subtle cumulative effects. Foxglove, hemlock, herbs that could gradually weaken or poison, tools that might someday give her leverage. She had begun to shift from passive observer to careful architect of influence, though no one yet suspected. By October, Ruth delivered a girl, darker-skinned, less valuable, in Nathaniel and Harrove's calculations. Relief surged quietly in Catherine, for at least one child would remain with its mother. But with Dinah's labor, tragedy struck. Her baby was stillborn, and Dinah herself died days later, leaving Catherine to scrub the blood from the quarters with trembling hands. She had tried, truly tried, to save a life, and failed. Yet Nathaniel's only concern was the loss to the ledger, a failure to produce a child that met the criteria. Catherine's despair deepened, her resolve hardening. She now understood that by late autumn, Catherine had begun to see the full scope of Sweetwater's hidden machinery. Children vanished without explanation, whisked away in the dead of night, removed from mothers who had no voice, no recourse. Ruth whispered fragments of the truth. Infants taken to other plantations, selected for traits deemed valuable by Nathaniel and Harrove's perverse criteria. 20, 25, perhaps more over the years, children treated not as life but as currency, as variables in a system designed to optimize labor, obedience, and profit. Each disappearance left a hollow in Catherine's chest, a constant reminder that her role as observer was inseparable from complicity. The network Harrove described was astonishing in its reach. Other planters, men who styled themselves as visionaries, shared children with desirable characteristics, recorded notes on temperament and intelligence, and coordinated breeding lines with a detachment that made murder seem mundane. Science had been weaponized, morality suspended, humanity reduced to measurable traits. Catherine realized that Sweetwater was merely one node in this quiet, sprawling system, a lattice of control hidden beneath the polite veneer of southern civility. And yet, within this darkness, Catherine began to cultivate a subtle awareness of power. Observation was not merely survival, it could become influence. She began to see patterns in Nathaniel's selections, in the ledger's columns, in the timing of visits and births. Each act, each calculation, left traces. She noted them secretly, in a separate diary hidden beneath the floorboards, far from Nathaniel's gaze. She studied herbs and plants, those with gradual, imperceptible effects, imagining ways that slow, careful manipulation might give her leverage. Every observation, every act of dissociation became preparation. But the psychological toll was immense. Maras came unbidden, blending memory and fear, the screams she refused to hear, the silence she could not forget. The dissociation she relied on to survive teetered at the edge of madness. Still, she forced herself to write, to watch, to calculate, turning horror into data, despair into strategy. It was a transformation as subtle as it was profound, from victim to scribe, from witness to covert architect of influence. And there was another layer of terror she could not ignore. The presence of men who believed themselves enlightened, rational, and just. Harrove, Nathaniel, and their network treated children as experimental subjects, women as instruments, and morality as a negotiable variable. Catherine's realization struck her like ice. She was not alone in her complicity, but neither was she powerless. If she could learn the rules of the system, understand its network, she could navigate it, and perhaps one day exploit it. The night grew heavy over Sweetwater. Candlelight flickered across the ledger pages, the women's rooms, the empty crib where another child had been taken. In that darkness, Catherine understood the first profound truth. Knowledge is a weapon, And the mind, when disciplined and patient, can be stronger. By winter, Sweetwater had transformed into something unrecognizable, a house of shadows and calculation. The women moved through their daily labor with hollowed eyes, their bodies catalogued, their children taken, their lives subjected to the merciless precision of Nathaniel's and Harrove's design. Catherine, forced to observe every birth, every detail, had begun to understand the patterns, which women were chosen, when, and why. The ledger was not just a record, it was a map of control, a blueprint of domination that extended far beyond the walls of the plantation. Harrove's network of planters had grown. Children deemed valuable were removed quietly in the night, shipped to other estates, their destinies decided by men who believed themselves enlightened. The system functioned like clockwork, each action a calculated measure of efficiency and gain. And Catherine, who once recoiled at the horror, began to recognize the mechanisms that kept it running: fear, compliance, secrecy, and the meticulous recording of human traits. She had become part of this network, unwillingly, yet she now saw the threads she could follow to anticipate the next move, to predict which child would vanish, which woman would be selected. Knowledge, she realized, was her only power. Her secret diary became a tool of survival. While Nathaniel's ledger recorded physical characteristics, projected value, and breeding potential, Catherine's notes captured context, patterns of disappearances, subtle signals among the enslaved women, the hidden rhythms of the plantation that even Nathaniel failed to notice. She began to see Harrove not as an invincible authority, but as a man dependent on his own data, his own calculations. Every measurement he made, every notation he recorded could be tracked, predicted, even manipulated. The realization sparked a dangerous clarity. The psychological strain was immense. Nightmares returned, merging past horrors with imagined futures, the weight of complicity pressing down relentlessly. Yet through the strain, Catherine honed her focus. She learned to separate observation from emotion when required, to detach her heart while keeping her mind razor-sharp. It was a survival technique, yes, but it was also the first step in turning survival into agency. She was no longer merely recording horrors. She was understanding the architecture of control, the system beneath the cruelty, and she began to see where it was vulnerable. And then, as the nights grew longer and the children vanished in increasing numbers, Catherine understood something deeper, something terrifying and empowering. The very structure that demanded her obedience could, if navigated with patience and intelligence, be turned into a tool. Knowledge was not just survival, it was power. And the first act of true power is to observe, to By early spring, Catherine's understanding of Sweetwater had reached a terrifying clarity. What Nathaniel and Harrove were orchestrating was no longer merely local. It was systematic, deliberate, and networked. The children taken in the dead of night were being distributed according to criteria that seemed almost unimaginable: skin tone, eye color, physical strength, perceived intelligence. Each child became a node in a hidden lattice of human manipulation, a product of deliberate calculation masquerading as science. Catherine began to see the program not as isolated acts of cruelty, but as a philosophy of power, a blueprint for controlling life itself. Harrove's ambitions extended beyond Nathaniel's estate. Through letters, through secret meetings, and through the exchange of children, he sought to cultivate what he called the ideal stock. Other planters in the South were complicit, men who believed themselves enlightened, rational, and morally justified. These men shared notes, measured traits, and evaluated lineage with a cold detachment that would make even the most seasoned observer recoil. And Catherine, compelled to witness it all, began to map these connections in her own mind, to track the flow of children, and to understand the rules of a system that reduced human beings to variables, data points, and property. Psychologically, Catherine had to fragment herself to survive. She watched, recorded, and dissociated. The women's silence, the men's restrained rage, the disappearances of children. It all weighed on her, threatening to collapse her mind under the pressure. Yet amid the horror, she discovered a subtle form of agency. Observation was no longer passive. It became anticipatory. By understanding patterns, by noting behaviors and timing, she could predict selections, foresee disappearances, and grasp the hidden logic of the system. Knowledge became a shoal. Knowledge became a weapon. And then came the ledger, the heart of the machine. Nathaniel's meticulous documentation of traits, pregnancies, and outcomes was horrifying in its precision. But Catherine realized that the ledger was also predictable. Every action followed rules, every woman selected, every child removed, every note recorded. If one could understand the rules, anticipate the patterns, even the system itself could be manipulated. She began to test her mind against it, quietly noting small discrepancies, contradictions, moments where human emotion slipped past the cold logic. It was in this crucible that Catherine transformed. From a witness forced into compliance, she began to evolve into a strategist. Survival demanded dissociation, yes, but strategy demanded observation, calculation, and subtle foresight. And as the days lengthened, and the shadows deepened across Sweetwater, she understood a truth more dangerous than any physical threat. Power does not only reside in force, power resides in understanding. By mid-spring, the pattern of disappearances had become impossible to ignore. Catherine watched mothers clench their fists, eyes wide with fear, knowing their children might vanish overnight. She listened to whispered conversations, piecing together fragments of what Ruth and the others had begun to tell her. Children with lighter skin, favorable physical traits, or calmer temperaments were selected first. Those deemed less desirable remained, trapped in the same cycle of labor and surveillance, their lives shaped entirely by the cold calculations of Nathaniel and Harrove. The scale of the operation, the methodical precision, revealed itself as something far beyond ordinary cruelty. It was a system, a network, an ideology of domination. Harrove's influence had grown, spreading the methodology to other plantations. The planters he collaborated with measured, exchanged, and traded children as though optimizing a herd of livestock. Letters between these men, written in careful, polite language, outlined the traits each sought, the outcomes they expected, and the strategies they used to maintain secrecy. Catherine began to track these communications as best she could, realizing that the system extended far beyond Sweetwater. It was a shadow network, hidden in plain sight, justifying atrocity under the guise of science. The psychological weight on Catherine became unbearable at times. She dissociated to survive, focusing on trivial details, the crack in the plaster, the flicker of candlelight, the faint smell of herbs. But the ledger, the observations, the silent mothers, and the missing children always lingered at the edges of her consciousness. And yet, in that psychological crucible, her mind sharpened. She began to see subtle weaknesses in the system, the reliance on meticulous documentation, the predictable patterns of selection, the assumptions these men made about compliance. Each observation became a strategic advantage. By now, Catherine's secret diary had evolved beyond mere recording. It was a map of the system, a catalogue of human cruelty and networked control, detailing every woman, every child, and every calculated decision. She studied the relationships, noting inconsistencies and opportunities. Every ledger entry, every whispered rumor, every observed hesitation became part of a mental framework she could use to understand, and perhaps one day influence, the machinery of domination. And yet, the human cost was constant, inescapable. The silent despair of the women, the trembling hope of those who remained, the fear etched into every glance, pressed upon her relentlessly. Catherine understood fully now. She could not stop the system outright. To survive, to preserve even a semblance of morality, she would have to operate within it, subtly, strategically, without drawing suspicion. She had become both witness and participant, It was in early August that Catherine witnessed, fully and irreversibly, the first of the systematic child removals. She had long suspected, pieced together rumors and ledger entries, but now the reality struck with visceral force. From her vantage point by the upstairs window, she watched men quietly maneuver a covered wagon through the shadows. Grace's child, pale-eyed and small, was lifted with deliberate care, wrapped in cloth that could not conceal its humanity, and carried away into the night. The air was thick with an almost holy silence. No cries, no protests, just the mechanical execution of a system that had been designed to erase life itself. Ruth and the other women endured with hollow eyes, performing their tasks as if their own bodies and souls had been anesthetized. Catherine recorded everything in her secret diary, noting not only the physical act but the patterns, the timing, the people involved, the methods used to preserve secrecy. The ledger Nathaniel maintained was meticulous, yes, but Catherine's observations captured the larger truth. This was not an isolated practice. It was a networked, repeatable, and carefully maintained operation, extending beyond Sweetwater into an invisible system of power. Every child taken was a thread in a tapestry Catherine now saw clearly, and each thread revealed both cruelty and control. The psychological weight was immense. She felt as though she had been pulled inside a vice, compressed between horror and necessity. Dissociation became instinctual. She focused on irrelevant details to preserve sanity, a crack in the wall, a whisper of wind, the faint scent of herbs. But the ledger, the disappearing children, and the obedient silence of the enslaved women haunted her consciousness. And yet, amid the crushing horror, Catherine's mind sharpened. She began to predict, to map, to anticipate. The removals followed patterns, the same methods, the same timing, the same measures of secrecy. The network was not infallible. It had rules, and rules could be learned, exploited, anticipated. By observing quietly and recording meticulously, Catherine began to see the outlines of her own agency. She could not stop the system, she knew that, but she could understand it, study it, and prepare for the moments when small interventions might have consequences. Knowledge became both shield and weapon. Every notation she made, every whisper she recorded, was a step toward control, a way to preserve her mind and her moral autonomy in a system designed to obliterate both. And as the wagon disappeared into the darkness with Grace's child, Catherine understood the cold, inevitable truth. The power of the system depended on compliance, secrecy, and fear. But the mind that observes without participating in its logic can always find openings. She had crossed from passive witness to active strategist. The ledger and its network were no longer merely instruments of terror. As August deepened, Catherine's role evolved from passive witness to something more dangerous, subtle strategist. She continued to record every detail in her hidden diary. Children's births, disappearances, physical traits, and the timing of Nathaniel and Harrove's selections. But now she was looking for patterns, openings, and contradictions. The system that once terrified her began to reveal its predictability. Every procedure, every ledger entry, every orchestrated removal followed rules, and rules could be studied, understood, and eventually exploited. The psychological burden remained suffocating. Nights were haunted by the vanished children, the hollow eyes of Ruth and Grace, and the oppressive silence that permeated Sweetwater. Yet Catherine learned to dissociate on command. She focused on minutiae, the flicker of candlelight across the floorboards, the faint scent of foxglove in the garden, the rhythm of the wind against the shutters. These small obsessions became her refuge, a way to maintain mental clarity while observing atrocities. Her mind, sharpened under pressure, began to see beyond what was presented, understanding both motive and method. Nathaniel and Harrove remained oblivious to her growing acuity. They were so focused on the cold logic of their measurements, the ledger's meticulous columns, and the supposed science of human breeding that they failed to notice her subtle manipulations. Catherine learned to interlace compliance with observation, to record exactly what was demanded while keeping her own insights hidden. Her diary became a map of the system, detailing every interaction, every compliance strategy, every possible weakness. She was building a mental framework that could outlast both men's control. Even the women under Nathaniel's and Harrove's authority began to reveal patterns to Catherine. The enslaved mothers, despite fear and despair, left subtle cues in their behavior, the way they held a child, glanced at the ledger, or exchanged silent signals with one another. Catherine began to record these cues as well, knowing they might provide leverage later. Understanding the psychological ecosystem of the plantation, the fears, the compliance, the unspoken rules, became as critical as noting physical traits in the ledger. By now, Catherine recognized the full, horrifying scope of the operation. Sweetwater was not an anomaly. It was a node in a larger, networked system of control designed to optimize human property while erasing humanity. And yet, within this system, Catherine had begun to cultivate a dangerous clarity. Observation was no longer mere survival. It was power. She could see the machine from both inside and outside, and with knowledge, patience, and calculation, even the most entrenched system could be influenced. By September, Catherine's understanding of Sweetwater had expanded beyond its walls. Harrove's influence was no longer confined to Nathaniel's estate. Letters, observations, and whispered rumors revealed a network of planters across the South, each participating in the systematic selection and distribution of children. The ledger entries at Sweetwater were mirrored elsewhere. Measurements, traits, predictions, and disappearances meticulously recorded, a quiet infrastructure of control that relied on secrecy, compliance, and fear. Every child taken, every woman selected, became a small node in a sprawling lattice of domination. Catherine observed how the system exploited both the oppressed and the complicit. The enslaved women bore the physical burden, the psychological terror, and the silent shame of compliance. The men, whether Nathaniel or those in Harrove's network, wielded authority under the guise of law and science, and Catherine, once a passive observer, now understood the duality of her position. She was both participant and strategist, forced to obey, yet uniquely positioned to see the weaknesses inherent in the system. Every ledger, every note, every whispered consultation revealed patterns she could track, predict, and potentially influence. She began to map connections. Children removed from Sweetwater were sent to specific plantations, favoring certain traits and lineages. Nathaniel's selections followed a rigid logic. Lighter skin, desirable temperament, physical strength, and intelligence were prioritized. Harrove's network reinforced these criteria, coordinating exchanges with other planters to maintain the flow of what they considered superior human stock. Catherine's diary, hidden beneath the floorboards, became an archive of human commodification, dates, names, traits, disappearances, and locations, a map of cruelty that also revealed points of predictability. Psychologically, Catherine's mind was sharpening under unbearable pressure. Nightmares haunted her sleep, yet her waking hours were filled with observation, calculation, and subtle pattern recognition. She dissociated to survive, but also trained herself to notice the faintest irregularities, the hesitation in a ledger entry, a delayed removal, a mother's brief glance. Each anomaly was a clue, a potential lever of influence. In the midst of horror, she discovered an uncomfortable truth. Survival required compliance, but mastery required attention, patience, and foresight. And then came the first faint glimmer of agency. Catherine realized that knowledge, precise, detailed, and hidden, was the only power she possessed. Every act of observation, every pattern documented, and every connection understood created a mental map that could outmaneuver Harrove's network if she were careful. The ledger and its network were no longer merely instruments of terror, they were puzzles to be deciphered. And Catherine, even in the depths of complicity, began to see the first outlines of a strategy. The By October, Catherine had reached a new threshold of awareness. The horror around her had become almost predictable, and with predictability came the faintest flicker of power. She could anticipate which women Nathaniel would select, when Harrove would arrive, and how each ledger entry would be made. Observation was no longer passive. It was a calculated act of strategy. Every detail, every pattern, every nuance of behavior she recorded in her secret diary became a tool. Knowledge was the only weapon she had in a system built to crush both mind and spirit. She began to experiment in subtle ways, small acts, recording a detail slightly differently, asking a seemingly innocuous question, lingering at the ledger's edge, allowed her to test the limits of Nathaniel and Harrove's attention without revealing her own insight. Every response, every pause, every hint of hesitation from the men was another piece of data, another opportunity to map the system's vulnerabilities. Catherine had learned that power in such a network did not require confrontation. It required understanding, patience, and the capacity to operate invisibly. The enslaved women remained trapped in a web of terror and compliance, but Catherine began to notice small signals of resistance. A whispered warning, a glance between mothers, a momentary shift in demeanor. These were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they spoke volumes. Catherine recorded these carefully, noting which women retained awareness and agency despite fear. She began to see that even in the most controlled environments, cracks existed. These cracks, once understood, could be leveraged. Psychologically, the pressure was relentless. The ledger, the disappearances, the silent despair of the women, the constant surveillance, it weighed on her like a storm pressing down. Nightmares came unbidden, blending reality with imagination, yet Catherine Haynes detrained herself to dissociate and focus on minutiae. Every flicker of candlelight, every scent, every sound became data, a way to remain anchored while the world around her collapsed into cruelty. And in that chaos, her mind began to sharpen. She could see the system as a whole, its mechanics, its predictable cycles, and its points of weakness. By the end of October, Catherine understood a profound truth. Absolute power in Sweetwater depended not only on fear, but on secrecy and predictability. And she now possessed the tools to navigate it. Observation, patience, and hidden knowledge could shift the balance, even in the smallest ways. She was no longer merely a witness. She was a strategist, quietly mapping the network, learning its rhythms, and waiting for the moment when subtle intervention might matter. Survival had transformed into the beginnings of control, and in that transformation, Catherine found a dangerous clarity. The ledger could be read, the system could be understood, and the mind that sees. By late October, subtle irregularities began to emerge in Harrove's methods, small deviations in measurements, inconsistent record-keeping, and rare moments of hesitation. To an untrained observer, they might have gone unnoticed, but Catherine's mind, honed by months of observation, detected every nuance. The system that Nathaniel and Harrove relied upon was meticulous, yet human fallibility was present in the smallest crevices. And in these crevices, Catherine glimpsed opportunity. Knowledge, she realized, was not only a shield, it was a lever. She began experimenting with subtle influence, testing the boundaries of the men's attention and control. A ledger entry she recorded slightly differently, an observation phrased with quiet ambiguity, a hesitation in response to a question, all became tools to probe the system without revealing her own comprehension. Every reaction from Nathaniel or Harrove was another datum, another confirmation of patterns she could predict. Catherine had become not just an observer, but a silent participant in the machinery, capable of guiding outcomes through subtle manipulation. The enslaved women, though terrified, provided additional insight. Catherine noted the fleeting glances, whispered warnings, and minor acts of resistance, the way Ruth adjusted her posture when she sensed an approaching overseer, or the subtle shifts in Grace's tone when discussing the ledger. These cues revealed resilience and latent agency even under extreme control. Catherine began to understand that control, no matter how absolute it appeared, was never perfect. Gaps existed, and knowledge of those gaps was power. Psychologically, Catherine was walking a razor's edge. Each observation, each manipulation, demanded dissociation from horror. The ledger, the disappearing children, and the silent despair of those around her pressed constantly, yet she learned to convert terror into clarity. The human mind, she realized, could endure unimaginable atrocities if trained to observe and analyze, to separate emotion from insight. In the heart of Sweetwater's darkness, her intellect became her fortress. By the end of October, a dangerous truth crystallized. She was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to master the system from within. Observation had evolved into strategy. Horror had been transmuted into calculation. Catherine could see the rules, predict the outcomes, and identify the weak points in a system that others believed unassailable. And with that realization came a profound understanding. To wield influence in a network built on secrecy, compliance, and fear, one must remain unseen, patient, and meticulous. By November, Catherine began to perceive the broader consequences of Sweetwater's systematic removals. The children taken in the dead of night were not just disappearing, they were entering a network that spanned Plantations, reinforcing Harrove's vision of optimized human stock. Letters, subtle mentions from Ruth, and ledger cross-references revealed the scale. Other estates received the children, each selected for traits deemed valuable, each integrated into a network of labor, breeding, and control. The system was vast, invisible to outsiders, yet Catherine could trace its lines like a cartographer of cruelty. Watching Grace and Ruth, Catherine observed the silent suffering, the hollowed eyes, the whispered fears, the stoic endurance of mothers who had no recourse. The psychological manipulation was total. Fear, secrecy, shame, and exhaustion bound them tightly to compliance. Yet Catherine noted the fractures, the glimpses of latent agency. A glance here, a hesitation there. Small acts of resistance existed even in this oppressive network. These fragments of human spirit became as valuable to Catherine as any ledger entry, evidence that the system, no matter how meticulously constructed, was not infallible. Her secret diary became a repository not just of horror, but of insight. She documented patterns in removals, reactions of the enslaved, and inconsistencies in Nathaniel and Harrove's execution. Each observation sharpened her understanding of the system's rules, its cycles, and its vulnerabilities. The network was sophisticated, yes, but by tracking its movements, she began to map its predictable paths. The ledger, once a symbol of control, became a code she could decipher, a structure she could navigate without exposure. Psychologically, the pressure was immense. Catherine wrestled with moral collapse, dissociation, and the grinding reality of complicity, yet within that pressure, her mind sharpened. Observation became strategy, horror became calculation. The disappearances, the ledger, and the silent despair were now data points, patterns to study and exploit. She began to recognize that knowledge was power, and that patience could convert survival into subtle influence. By the end of November, Catherine's clarity reached a turning point. She was no longer merely a witness. She had become a silent strategist, capable of understanding the system's breadth, predicting its actions, and identifying openings for subtle intervention. Sweetwater's network, vast and ruthless, could be read, understood, and anticipated. And Catherine realized a dangerous truth. Mastery over such a system did not require force. It required observation, patience, and the courage to act invisibly. By December, Catherine's understanding of Sweetwater and its network had reached a frightening depth. She no longer saw the horrors as isolated incidents. She saw them as a meticulously orchestrated system designed to maximize control, productivity, and compliance. Each child removed, Each ledger entry, each carefully selected trait contributed to a broader vision, one in which humans were treated as property, measured and manipulated like livestock. The scale of this network was staggering, and Catherine now recognized its predictable logic. Her observations became increasingly strategic. She noted not only the actions of Nathaniel and Harrove, but also the reactions of the enslaved women. Subtle shifts in posture, fleeting eye contact, or small deviations from routine became valuable data. These were signals of hidden agency, hints of cracks in a system that appeared inviolable. Catherine began to catalogue these cues in her diary alongside ledger details, creating a map of human behavior layered over the ledger's cold calculations. Knowledge, she realized, was her only weapon within this architecture of cruelty. The psychological toll was immense. Every day brought fresh horrors: children taken, pregnancies monitored, women compelled to participate, and the ever-present ledger documenting every movement. Catherine learned to dissociate, to focus on minutiae, the flicker of lamplight, the scent of herbs, the rhythm of the wind through the shutters, yet her mind remained vigilant, constantly analyzing, tracking patterns, and noting deviations. Horror became context, fear became data, and observation became power. By now, Catherine had begun subtle interventions. She asked questions in ways that guided Nathaniel's decisions without revealing her own insight, emphasized certain details in her records to shift attention, and tracked inconsistencies in Harrove's measurement as to exploit them mentally. These small manipulations required patience, precision, and absolute discretion. One wrong move, one hint of defiance, could result in her imprisonment, exposure, or worse. And yet she persisted, because the ledger, the network, and the patterns it revealed were now tools she could wield. In the silence of her private quarters, Catherine reflected on the dangerous clarity she had gained. The system of control was vast, brutal, and seemingly omnipotent, but it was not infallible. Patterns could be anticipated, human behavior could be mapped, and the network's reliance on secrecy was its vulnerability. Observation, patience, and strategic insight were her weapons. In the heart of Sweetwater's cruelty, she had transformed from a passive witness into a strategist, quietly mastering the machinery of. By mid-December, Catherine's comprehension of Sweetwater had grown beyond mere survival. She was beginning to see the moral architecture of the network itself. Each ledger entry, each child removed, each measured trait was not only a reflection of cruelty but a statement of power, an attempt to assert control over life itself. Nathaniel and Harrove believed that their calculations, their meticulous documentation, and their scientific veneer placed them above morality. Catherine, forced into observation, now recognized the lie. Power without accountability is always unstable. She began to track the network's consequences with precision. Children taken from Sweetwater were distributed to distant plantations according to traits meticulously catalogued in the ledger. Mothers remained behind, hollow-eyed and obedient, while their offspring vanished into a system designed to normalize atrocity. The scale of manipulation was staggering, yet Catherine saw predictability in every movement. Patterns emerged: timing of removals, selection of traits, methods of transport, and even the subtle deference of those implementing the system. To survive and eventually influence outcomes, she had to understand every thread. Catherine's psychological fortitude sharpened under the pressure. Dissociation remained vital. She numbed herself to the immediate horror while analyzing the structures beneath it. Observation became strategy, and strategy became subtle intervention. Small acts of influence, deliberate phrasing, careful attention to what she recorded, measured hesitation, allowed her to probe the system without revealing her comprehension. Even the smallest misstep could be deadly, yet she learned patience, precision, and discretion. Her mind became a scalpel, cutting through layers of fear, secrecy, and compliance. The enslaved women offered further insight. Their subtle gestures, whispered warnings, and minute shifts in behavior were proof that even in absolute control, human agency persisted. Catherine catalogued these signals, understanding that they were both lifelines for the women and leverage for her. By mapping the psychology of the oppressed alongside the mechanisms of the oppressors, she could anticipate outcomes and navigate the machinery of Sweetwater with a combination of caution and calculated audacity. By the end of December, Catherine had achieved a dangerous equilibrium. Horror and calculation, compliance and strategy, observation and subtle intervention intertwined within her. She could now see the system's flaws, its points of predictability, and its reliance on secrecy and rigid adherence to procedure. Knowledge had become her weapon, and patience her shield. In the shadow of Sweetwater's absolute control, she had transformed, from passive witness to strategist, from terrified wife to observer with the beginnings of mastery. She was no longer merely surviving, she was. By January, Catherine's awareness extended beyond Sweetwater. Letters, observations, and subtle hints from Harrove's visits revealed a network of planters across the South, each participating in the systematic selection and distribution of children. Harrove's science was not isolated. It was a carefully orchestrated ideology, reinforcing itself through secrecy, documentation, and collaboration. Sweetwater was merely one node in a sprawling lattice of control, a machine designed to perpetuate itself across miles of plantation land. Catherine began mapping this network in her diary. She recorded every detail: which children were taken, what traits were prioritized, the timing of removals, and the correspondences she could access indirectly. Each ledger entry became a clue. Each observation revealed patterns that extended far beyond Nathaniel's estate. The system's breadth was horrifying, yet its predictability was a vulnerability. Knowledge of patterns meant anticipation, and anticipation meant potential influence. Her diary, hidden beneath floorboards, was no longer a record of horror. It had become a blueprint for understanding and perhaps subtly bending the network. Psychologically, Catherine's transformation deepened. Horror, fear, and moral anguish remained constant pressures, but she learned to channel them into clarity. Dissociation allowed her to observe atrocities without breaking, while analysis turned raw terror into insight. She recognized that the enslaved women, despite their oppression, exhibited subtle forms of resistance, moments of defiance, coded gestures, and quiet warnings. These signals became data as valuable as any ledger entry, revealing the human dimension of a system obsessed with measurement and efficiency. Catherine also began subtle manipulations. She phrased observations in the ledger to shift attention, emphasized certain traits to guide Nathaniel's selections, and noticed inconsistencies in Harrove's measurements. These small acts carried little risk individually but provided her a sense of agency, a mental foothold in an otherwise absolute system. Each intervention was strategic, calculated, and invisible, allowing her to remain compliant while quietly exerting influence. By the end of January, Catherine's role had changed fundamentally. She was no longer merely a passive witness of atrocities. She was an observer with insight into a vast network of power and control, capable of predicting actions, understanding systemic patterns, and leveraging subtle interventions. Sweetwater's cruelty, far from being absolute, revealed cracks to the patient, observant mind. Knowledge had become both shield and weapon, and in that dangerous clarity Catherine understood the first rule of surviving and mastering a world built on secrecy, fear, and domination. See. By February, Catherine had begun to test the boundaries of her influence within Sweetwater's system. The ledger, once a passive record of atrocities, had become a tool. She recorded observations with subtle alterations, emphasized certain traits in ways that shifted Nathaniel's attention, and highlighted minor irregularities in Harrove's measurements. Each small adjustment was deliberate, never enough to expose her awareness, yet enough to gauge the men's reactions. Observation had evolved into strategy, and strategy was her first taste of agency. The enslaved women remained central to her calculations. Ruth, Grace, and others moved through their daily routines under the oppressive weight of expectation, yet subtle cues persisted. A glance, a change in posture, a whispered warning. They were tiny signals of resilience. Catherine began cataloguing these cues alongside the ledger entries, creating a mental map of both control and resistance. In this, she found the first threads of possibility. Understanding human behavior in a network of terror revealed leverage. Even the smallest acts could ripple outward, influencing decisions without overt defiance. Psychologically, Catherine's mind was stretched taut. The horrors of Sweetwater pressed against her constantly, yet dissociation had become instinctual. She could separate herself from immediate trauma, focusing instead on patterns, behaviors, and predictability. Observation transformed fear into clarity. Terror became data. The children removed, the ledger entries, the silent despair of the women. Each was a piece of the system, and in mapping it, Catherine found the outlines of power. Survival alone had evolved into strategic comprehension. Harrove's network, while vast and carefully maintained, revealed subtle inconsistencies. Timing of child removals varied slightly. Ledger entries occasionally contained minor errors, and the men themselves made assumptions that betrayed their reliance on secrecy. Catherine's patient observation identified these flaws, and she began to exploit them mentally. Small interventions imperceptible to Nathaniel and Harrove allowed her to test the system, anticipate outcomes, and influence decisions invisibly. Knowledge, patience, and discretion had become her weapons. By the end of February, Catherine understood a profound truth. Power did not always require force. In a system built on secrecy, compliance, and fear, understanding and subtlety could achieve what overt action could not. The ledger, the network, and the patterns it revealed were tools she could wield. Observation, strategy, and quiet calculation had transformed her from passive witness into an invisible architect of influence. Sweetwater's machinery of domination was vast, but through knowledge, patience. By March, Catherine had moved beyond mere observation into deliberate, calculated intervention. Each ledger entry she recorded was now a tool of influence. A subtle emphasis here, a carefully phrased note there, guided Nathaniel's decisions without revealing her comprehension. Harrove's measurements, once treated as absolute, were gently contradicted or highlighted in ways that allowed her to test the system's boundaries. She had become a strategist operating invisibly, manipulating outcomes in a network designed to erase individuality and agency. The enslaved women remained both her subjects of study and silent allies in resilience. Catherine noticed minute signals, slight hesitations in behavior, fleeting glances of recognition, subtle gestures that hinted at understanding and awareness beneath their forced compliance. She recorded these observations meticulously, creating a layered map of human behavior entwined with the machinery of oppression. Every subtle act of resistance became data, revealing how the network's reliance on secrecy and obedience could be anticipated and gently manipulated. Psychologically, Catherine had reached a dangerous equilibrium. Horror, moral anguish, and terror continued to press upon her mind, but she had learned to convert these forces into analytical clarity. Dissociation allowed her to focus on patterns, predict outcomes, and measure reactions. She understood that every action she took carried risk. One misstep could lead to her exposure, punishment, or imprisonment. But calculated observation allowed her to weigh probabilities, to operate within the system while gradually bending it. Knowledge had become a weapon, patience its shield. Harrove's network, vast and methodical, was not flawless. Catherine detected patterns in child removals, timing, and ledger inconsistencies. By aligning these observations with the behavior of the enslaved women, she began to anticipate movements, outcomes, and decisions. Small interventions, such as subtly emphasizing one child's traits over another or recording a minor inconsistency, tested the network's rigidity. Each experiment, however minute, taught her how far influence could extend without detection. By the end of March, Catherine understood a chilling yet empowering truth. The most dangerous power in a system built on fear and secrecy was the mind that could see the rules clearly. She was no longer merely surviving the machinery of Sweetwater. She was navigating it, understanding it, and exercising invisible control over outcomes. Observation, patience, and subtle manipulation had transformed her from passive witness to strategist. In the shadows of cruelty, knowledge